The War of the Roses was a turning point in British history. The series of wars between the Lancasters and the Yorks led to a lot of bloodshed, murder, death, usurpers, and even a missing persons case, namely that of the two princes, Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. Now, many speculate the two princes were murdered by order of their uncle, Richard III, but could it be possible that Richard III did not kill the two boys, but instead struck a deal with their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, allowing them to live under the premise that they would adopt aliases and live out normal lives? Today we will discuss this conspiracy theories and why I do not think this is the likely option. The year is 1483, King Edward IV is dead, and his son, Prince Edward V, is now next in line for the throne. Up until the death of his father, Prince Edward was living in Ludlow Castle. Upon hearing the news of his father's demise, he travelled to London, where he was placed in the Tower of London to await his coronation. Later on, he was joined by his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York. Now, this was not unusual at the time, since it was customary for royals to stay in the Tower of London until their coronation. Prince Edward V's coronation was scheduled for the 22nd of June, 1483. However, before this could take place, Parliament had declared both princes illegitimate. This was due to the fact that their father, Henry IV, was contracted to marry Eleanor Butler, but chose to marry Elizabeth Woodville instead. In the eyes of the court, this made their wedding unlawful and therefore made the princes illegitimate. Now, shortly after this announcement, the two princes were seen less and less until they were never heard from again. On the 6th of July, 1483, King Richard took his place as the King of England. Now, amongst many of the theories about what happened to the young princes, I find this one to be the most interesting. The idea that Richard III never killed his nephews, but instead struck a deal with their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, and allowed the boys to live under the premise that they would adopt aliases, live out normal lives, and denounce all claims to the throne. Now, in 1487, a boy named Lambert Simnel claimed to be the lost Edward V. He gathered roughly 2,000 men for his claim to the throne, and at the Battle of Stokes, he was captured by the Tudor king. Now, he was imprisoned for a couple of years, and later was employed in the Tudor king's kitchens. Now, in 1491, 8 years after the disappearances of the two princes, a man named Perkin Warbeck claimed to be Richard, Duke of York. Now, he gathered enough men to attempt an invasion of England, which was unsuccessful. He too was captured by the Tudor king. And eventually, in 1497, he later confessed to being an impostor. Now, if we apply Daniel Pipes' analytical tools, we can see the flaws of this theory. Number 1, dismissing of contradictory evidence. It is commonly thought that James Tyrrell was asked by Richard III to execute the two boys in the Tower. James Tyrrell used two of his men, John Dighton and Miles Forrest, to go into the Tower of London and to suffocate these boys as they slept. Later on in his life, James Tyrrell was convicted of treason, and it was at this time that he confessed to the murder of the two boys. Not only that, but Perkin Warbeck also confessed to being an impostor. It seems a common theme of those who support King Richard III's innocence to dismiss this contradictory evidence and label it instead as Tudor propaganda. 2. Obscurity of evidence. Now, according to an article written by Philippa Langley, who was the one that discovered King Richard III's bones and is a heavy supporter of Richard's innocence, Langley conveniently fails to mention the fact that it was an Oxford priest named Richard Simons who decided that Lambert Simnel was Edward V. Now, that is according to an article written by Britannica. Now, according to another article written by Charles Knightley for the English Heritage website, the impostor Lambert Simnel was the son of an Oxford craftsman. Furthermore, the Tudor King Henry did not see Simnel as a threat, so much so that he decided to employ him in his kitchens. On top of this, the political science and sociological impact of the time can be taken into consideration. Now, in terms of political science, over the years that Elizabeth was queen, she placed many of her family members at court, and upon Richard's rule, he did not like many members of Elizabeth's family, so he removed them from court. Now, if this deal really was struck with Elizabeth, then she could have returned sometime later with the two princes and restored her family's influence on the crown. Now, as for sociological anthropology, the public perception of a monarch's rule is essential for a monarch's reign. If the public is not in favour of the monarch, it can mean the downfall of a king. Now, unfortunately for Richard III, the public perception was not in his favour. The accusation that King Richard was a child killer, naturally, did not sit well with the British public of the time, nor did the idea that it was suggested that he marry his niece, Elizabeth of York, after the passing of his wife, just 2 years into his reign. To top it all off, his usurpation of the throne made him unpopular at court. Richard attempted to remove those who did not like him at court, but inevitably it led to his downfall. On August 22nd, 1485, King Richard was slain in the Battle of Bosworth. It's stories like that of the missing princes that has intrigued people for centuries, inspiring a love for history and conspiracy theories. Perhaps the most prominent example of how the War of the Roses was consumed by the public is HBO's show, Game of Thrones. George R. Martin based his series off of many events and battles that took place over the 30 years of the War of the Roses. Now, we may never really know what happened to the two princes. We may remain a mystery forever, but at the very least, we can deduct from Pipe's analytical tools that they were not in fact given a second chance by their uncle Richard III, and in fact, they were most likely murdered by the man who was responsible for their safety and security, Richard III.